The desert floor was merciless beneath her, each grain of sand burning into her skin like 1,000 tiny embers. Her breath came ragged, forced through clenched teeth, but she refused to cry out. The bullet had torn through her femur just minutes before, shattering bone and sending a white-hot jolt of agony radiating through her body. She should have been motionless, fading into the oblivion that so often followed such wounds, but she wasn't. She clutched her rifle, dragging herself forward, each inch of movement carved from raw determination. 600 meters of open desert stretched between her and the 3 Marines who lay bleeding ahead, caught in a kill zone with no cover. 600 meters that might as well have been 6 miles, each pull of her elbows through the sand another negotiation with death. She had no guarantee she would survive the next 30 seconds. The air still crackled with gunfire, enemy rounds snapping low across the desert like angry wasps. The sound was constant, oppressive, forcing her deeper into the sand as if the earth itself might shield her. Her blood soaked into the soil beneath her, leaving a dark trail that marked her path. Yet her jaw was set, her eyes locked on the barely visible figures ahead. There was no hesitation. There was no choice. They were her Marines. Before this moment, she had lived her life defined by a quiet resilience few ever saw. Her childhood had been filled with whispered doubts about whether she belonged in the places she chose to fight for. She had carried those doubts into boot camp, through sleepless nights of training, and into battlefields where respect wasn't granted but clawed for. Every sacrifice she had made was stitched into the scars she bore. The friends she had buried, the promises she had kept, the silent nights of grief that had hardened her resolve. She had seen blood before, felt loss before, and yet this moment was different. This was not just survival. This was her defining truth, being written into the dust of a nameless desert. The men who doubted her strength were not here to witness the crawl. The voices that whispered she was unfit, that she lacked the grit, could never see the way her hands tore through sand, fingernails split and caked with grit and blood. What they could not know was that her silence had always been her weapon. She never shouted back. She never begged for recognition. She let the battlefield decide. And the battlefield had always told the truth. Each pull forward tore at her wound, jagged bones scraping against shredded flesh. The pain was beyond screaming, beyond tears. It was a furnace burning everything soft within her until only steel remained. Ahead, one Marine struggled weakly, trying to lift his head before collapsing again into the sand. Another clutched his side, blood spilling through his fingers. The third lay too still. The sight carved into her chest like a blade, but she did not allow grief room to bloom. She forced her body forward. The desert sun was merciless, pressing down like the weight of judgment itself. Sweat mixed with blood until her vision blurred. She tasted copper, grit, and the bitter dryness of a mouth too long without water. Time lost meaning. The crawl became the only rhythm she knew. Pull, drag, grit teeth, breathe. Pull, drag, grit teeth, breathe. Every inch forward whispered the same vow, not one more will be left behind. Those who saw her from afar would later remember the image etched in their minds. A lone figure, wounded and crawling through fire, refusing to yield. Even as bullets cracked overhead, she did not flinch. She seemed less like flesh and blood, more like some force that could not be extinguished. Her silence screamed louder than any battle cry. The Marines ahead were slipping closer to death, and she knew the cost of hesitation. She reached the first one, her bloodied hands shaking as she grabbed his collar and dragged him into the shadow of a shallow depression in the sand. Her body shrieked in protest, yet she moved to the next, then the next, each movement a war against herself. She felt the weight of them, the reality that she was just one broken body trying to move 3, and still she refused to stop. Later, when others told the story, they would call it impossible. They would wonder how one soldier with a shattered femur could carry 3 grown men to safety across 600 meters of fire. But those who understood knew the truth. She had carried heavier burdens long before this day. She had carried the invisible weight of silence, the relentless trial of being underestimated, the grief of folded flags and names etched on stone. Compared to those, this was only another battlefield demanding proof of her will, and in the end, she delivered. With torn hands, she pulled the last Marine into cover. With her last reserves of strength, she shielded them with her own body until support arrived. The world blurred around her as medics descended, voices sharp with urgency, but she no longer heard them. She had already given all she had. When she woke days later, the whispers reached her again, but this time they were not doubts. They were reverent, they were awed. Crowds stood when her story was told. Men who once dismissed her bowed their heads in silence. One of the Marines whose life she had saved wept openly at her bedside, unable to speak through the weight of gratitude. She did not need their words. She had always known the truth. Honor is not loud. Courage does not boast. Sacrifice does not ask for recognition. True strength is silent, unshakable, and born in the moments when no one is watching but everything is at stake. And as her story spread, strangers whispered her name with respect, carrying her strength into their own battles, both seen and unseen. For in her silence, she had spoken the loudest truth of all. No one is ever left behind. Now the question remains for all who hear it. What will you do when the world doubts you? When the weight is unbearable? When the silence is heavy? Will you stop, or will you crawl through fire for what you know is right? Her answer had already been written in blood and sand.